In this fragment, I want to look at a thinker who is foundational for understanding the modern left, and that thinker is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I'll do a fragment later on Rousseau as, in Nietzsche's words, the first modern man. But first, I want to focus on his political rather than his social or cultural influence. I'm going to look at 4 elements of modern leftism that Rousseau introduces as part of a complete package. And the key work for first approaching Rousseau, in my view, is the Discourse on the Origin and the Foundations of Inequality Among Men, a work commonly styled as the Second Discourse. The reason why you start here, and not with something like the social contract, is because the fundamental principles necessary for understanding later works like the social contract are in the Second Discourse. And if you read the Second Discourse closely, Rousseau basically tells you to start there. The Discourse on Inequality was originally written in 1754 as an entry in a contest run by the Academy of Dijon on the question, what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? The reason this work is called the Second Discourse is because Rousseau wrote an earlier discourse on the sciences and arts as an entry in a contest which he won in 1750. We now refer to that as the First Discourse, and the first and second together, they kind of made his name in Europe. If you watch my earlier fragment on Aristotle, I noticed that Aristotle distinguished between political regimes based on excellence, which I identified with the political right, and political regimes based on equality, which I identified with the political left. It's no mistake that in a work in which Rousseau describes his ideal state as a democratic government, wisely tempered, that is, a work in which Rousseau stakes his place on the political left, he does so in the context of a discussion of equality and inequality. As I said at the start, there are 4 key elements of modern leftism which you can find in here. Actually, there are more, but I'll focus on 4 in particular. And those elements are a radically individualist conception of humanity, a view of man as a passionate thinker rather than as a rational animal, a conception of human nature as perfectible, a view which Thomas Sowell characterizes as the unconstrained vision of man, and fourth, a conception of society that leads naturally to resentment of the rich and powerful. Rousseau is famous for his particular view of man in the state of nature. One interesting thing about it, which I find in later thinkers as different from Rousseau as Nietzsche, is how much Rousseau insists on socialized man as a weakened form of natural man. So let us be careful not to confuse savage man with the men we have before our eyes. In the forests, the horse, cat, bull, and even the donkey, for the most part, have a greater height. All have a more robust constitution, more energy, strength, and courage in the forests than in our homes. They lose half of these advantages by becoming domesticated, and we could say that all our care in treating these animals well and feeding them ends up merely degrading them. The same is true of man himself. By becoming sociable and enslaved, he becomes weak, fearful, and groveling, and his soft and effeminate way of life ends by enervating both his strength and his courage. Let us add that between the savage and domesticated conditions, the difference between man and man must be even greater than the one between beast and beast. For if animal and man have been treated equally by nature, all the things man gives himself for his own convenience, more than he does to the animals he tames, are so many particular causes which make him degenerate more appreciably. And so when he comes to think about man in the state of nature, he sees man, the animal, as a simple creature, not in need of anything, not really even in need of language. His needs are quite few. By considering man, in a word, as he must have come from the hands of nature, I see an animal less strong than some, less agile than others, but taking everything into account with the most advantageous structure of all. I see him eating his fill under an oak tree, quenching his thirst at the first stream, finding his bed at the foot of the same tree which provided his meal, and with that, his needs are satisfied. Thomas Hobbes' conception of nature was that man was essentially in a state of war of all against all. The state, in Hobbes, arises from how deplorable this state of nature is. But Rousseau has a different vision of man. He thinks man does not naturally make war on his fellows, and his reason for this is that he sees man as having two fundamental drives: a drive to preserve himself and an innate pity, which makes him naturally good. Thus, setting aside all those scientific books which teach us only to see men the way they have made themselves, and meditating upon the first and simplest operations of the human soul, I believe I discern there two principles prior to reason. One makes us passionately interested in our well-being and in our own preservation, and the other inspires in us a natural repugnance at seeing any sensitive being perish or suffer, in particular, beings like ourselves. And he later makes it clear that he is indeed differing from Hobbes specifically. There is, in addition, another principle which Hobbes did not notice, and which, having been given to man to soften, in certain circumstances, the ferocity of his amour-propre, or before the birth of this love, the desire to preserve himself, tempers the ardor he has for his well-being by an innate repugnance to seeing a creature like himself suffer. People only like to see others suffer, in Rousseau's view, when their natural instincts have been perverted by society. But man in a state of nature, while he may pity his fellow men, has absolutely no need of them, not even for a family. Let us conclude that wandering in the forests without labor, without speech, without a home, without war, and without relationships, with no need for his fellow men, and similarly with no desire to harm them, perhaps even without ever recognizing any of them individually, savage man, subject to few passions and self-sufficient, would have had only the sentiments and enlightenment appropriate to this state. Elsewhere he makes clear that sexual desire among savage man would be a momentary passion that went away as soon as it was fulfilled. And even mothers and children, there would be a natural connection there, which he sees, but his view is that as soon as a child would be capable of handling itself, living on its own, it would probably go its own way and perhaps never even see its parents again, not unlike certain other animals. So that's still human in Rousseau's view. Rousseau sees that as, well, that's our original frame. That is what we are in a state of nature. But man does not remain in this state of nature as Rousseau imagines for him, because his nature is perfectible. Man has a degree of choice rather than pure animal instinct, and it is choice rather than reason which helps distinguish the human from the animal for Rousseau. In every animal, I see only an ingenious machine to which nature has given senses so that it can re-energize and protect itself up to a certain point from everything that tends to destroy or to disturb it. I see precisely the same things in the human machine, with this difference. Nature alone causes all the operations in the beast, whereas man contributes to his own operation in his capacity as a free agent. One chooses or refuses by instinct, and the other by an act of freedom. This means that the beast cannot deviate from the rule prescribed for it, even when it would be advantageous to do so, and that man does deviate from the rule, often to his disadvantage. That is why a pigeon would die of hunger next to a bowl filled with the finest meats, as would a cat sitting on piles of fruit or grain, although both of them could feed themselves very well on the food they reject if they were of a mind to try it. For this reason, dissolute men abandon themselves to excesses which bring them fever and death, because the mind corrupts the sense, and because the will still speaks when nature is silent. Now, I see precisely this view of man held by such people as modern evolutionary biologists. People like Richard Dawkins and Brett Weinstein both talk in this way, saying that man does not have to follow certain evolutionary imperatives, one such imperative, for example, being to prefer his own kind to strangers. Neither of these men want a social Darwinist kind of morality, and they seem to think that reason or choice allows us to avoid that. But it is Rousseau's view of man's freedom which leads him to the view that man's nature is characterized by perfectibility, by this ability to improve himself. But if the difficulties which surround all these questions leave some room for contesting this difference between man and animal, there is another very particular quality which distinguishes them and about which there can be no dispute. That is, the faculty of perfecting oneself, a faculty which, with the help of circumstances, develops all the others in succession, and which resides among us as much in the species as in the individual. Whereas an animal is, at the end of a few months, what it will be all its life, and its species, at the end of 1,000 years, is what it was during the first year of this millennium. Why is man alone subject to becoming an imbecile? Is it not because that is when he returns to his primitive condition, and because the beast, which has acquired nothing and also has nothing to lose, always retains his instinct, whereas man, once he loses by old age or other accidents everything which his perfectibility has led him to acquire, falls back in this way even lower than a beast? It would be sad for us to be forced to concur that this distinctive and almost unlimited faculty is the source of all the misfortunes of man, that this is what pulls him by the power of time out of this original condition, in which he would live through peaceful and innocent days, that it is what gives birth with the centuries to his enlightenment and his errors, his vices and his virtues, and eventually makes him the tyrant of himself and of nature. So, man's drive to master himself and also master nature, his drive towards science, for example, that comes out of this idea of perfectibility. He characterizes this as an almost unlimited faculty. Man seems to be an almost infinitely perfectible creature. Now put those two ideas together. Man is perfectible, and man in his current state is in a bad way. If you put those two ideas together, you can arrive at a view where it doesn't have to be that way. We can use man's perfectibility to improve his state and make a better world. Rousseau's vision gives vast scope to this view, and while certain notions of human progress ruled Europe essentially until the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, a progressive view of man in the world still persists. And going along with this idea of man's nature as one of perfectibility, we also see in Rousseau an insistence upon the socially constructed character of man. Not everything is socially constructed in Rousseau, but essentially all that is bad is, and here I'll bring in the opening sentence of his book called The Emile, in which he writes, "All is good leaving the hands of the author of things. All degenerates in the hands of men." Or to return to the Second Discourse, this is how Rousseau characterizes the importance of social construction. Thus, a sturdy or delicate temperament, along with the strength or weakness which stems from it, often come more from the rough or effeminate manner in which one has been raised than from the body's original constitution. It is the same with the forces of the mind. Education not only establishes a difference between cultivated minds and those that are not, but it increases the difference among the former group in proportion to their culture. For if a giant and a dwarf walk along the same route, each pace the two of them take will give a new advantage to the giant. Now, if we compare the prodigious diversity in the forms of education and ways of life which prevail in the different orders of the civil state, with the simplicity and uniformity of animal and savage life, where everyone feeds on the same foods, lives in the same manner, and does exactly the same things, we will understand how much the difference between man and man must be less in the state of nature than in society, and how much natural inequality must increase in the human species as a result of the inequality of institutions, right? So here we can see the immense importance of culture and education, two of the cornerstones of modern leftism. And again, those are important because of that perfectibility of man, that unconstrained vision which Rousseau has of human nature. Now, a third element that you see in Rousseau, and this one has influence beyond just, let's say, political leftism. I see traces of this in many different places. And in fact, I think this element is the one which most endeared Rousseau to the generations of artists and writers who came after him and through whom much of his influence spread across Europe. And that element is the view of man as a passionate thinker rather than a rational animal. Whatever moralists may say about the subject, human understanding, owes a great deal to the passions, which by common acknowledgement also owe a great deal to it. It is through their activity that our reason is perfected. We seek to understand only because we desire to enjoy, and it is not possible to conceive why someone who has neither desires nor fears would take the trouble to reason. The passions, in their turn, originate from our needs and their progress from our knowledge, for we cannot desire or fear things except through the ideas we can have about them, or by simple natural impulse. And savage man, deprived of every kind of enlightenment, experiences only the passions of the latter sort. His desires do not go beyond his physical needs. We seek to understand only because we desire to enjoy. This is the view, for example, that Jonathan Haidt takes in his book on moral foundations. He believes that morality originates in emotional tendencies, which we rationalize from after the fact. And Rousseau's idea that it's not possible to conceive why a being that doesn't desire or fear would even take the trouble to reason. This is far from the conception of God that one can find in ancient philosophy or even in ancient theology, where, of course, God is rational, but he's not necessarily subject to human desires or passions. But for Rousseau, that doesn't make sense. And if you look into many other thinkers after Rousseau, I think you'll find that a lot of them essentially agree on this point. Disinterested rationalization is looked on with skepticism at best. Instead, Rousseau's view of a complex interaction between reason, understanding, emotions, desires, instincts, fears, and so on, that's still a pretty commonly held view of who we are as human beings. And incidentally, I think even some of the classical views would agree that most men are like this. Now, the last element in Rousseau, which we can see in the modern left, is also the strongest, the most malign, and also the most characteristic of him. And this one needs to be examined in a little more detail because there is a long argument attached to it, essentially the main argument of the Second Discourse. And that element is the strong sense of resentment, which he gives both a voice to and arguments in support of. Now let's start at the beginning. Rousseau begins his analysis with a distinction between natural inequality and political inequality. In the human species, I conceive two forms of inequality. One I call natural or physical, because it is established by nature and consists of the differences in age, health, bodily strength, and qualities of the mind or soul. The other we can call moral or political inequality because it depends on some kind of convention, and because it is established or at least authorized by the consent of men. This latter form consists of the different privileges that some men enjoy to the detriment of others, such as being wealthier, more honored, or more powerful than they are, or even making other men obey them. Now, this idea of privileges that some men enjoy to the detriment of others is a little unusual because what he's saying is if Rousseau's boss has a position over him, but the boss is a fool, that's unjust to Rousseau. He suffers from that. That's a detriment to him, even though the boss maybe didn't take anything from him or even do anything to him positively. Nevertheless, he enjoys an unearned privilege over him and is guilty. Now, I use this particular example because in Rousseau's Confessions, he tells a story about working for a French ambassador as his secretary, and in that story he expresses pretty much these exact sentiments. Now, this notion of people with unearned privilege being oppressors, in a sense, is one that we should find quite familiar today. It's one that our society argues over all the time. For example, in America, when people argue about the concept of white privilege. Arguments about this, although they're founded in Marxist theory, that theory in turn goes back to the resentment that we see on display in Rousseau, and in this particular notion here. Now, a little bit later, he makes it clear that the reason why he has this view, is that there is no essential link between natural inequality and political inequality. Just because, some men are smarter, that doesn't explain all the people who have more wealth and more power. They didn't get that because they were all smarter. Maybe some of them are, but many of them are not. And you would still have to explain, well, the ones who are not, how did they get it? Okay, so that's basically what I mean, what he means by there being no essential link. And here's what he says: even less can we seek whether there might be some essential link between the two inequalities. For that would be asking, in other terms, if those who command are necessarily worth more than those who obey, and if the powers of the body or the mind, wisdom or virtue, are always found in the same individuals in proportion to power or wealth. So obviously that's not the case. It may be a good question to discuss among slaves while their masters are listening, but one not suitable for reasonable and free men seeking the truth. So the idea that because it's not always found and it's not always in proportion, this idea of proportion, this is a very big point with leftists even now, who often use disparities in outcomes between groups to argue for various social schemes. So they apply this not only to individuals in society, but to groups in society to show that one group or another has been oppressed. But Rousseau is correct that some people have wealth and power and honor and do not have the natural qualities which make them deserve these things. Well, that's always been true. People have always observed that. If you listen to my guide to the Iliad, that's part of the fundamental conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon, is that Achilles is naturally the more gifted warrior, whereas Agamemnon is king by virtue of ruling over more men. In other words, Achilles has natural inequalities in his favor, but Agamemnon has political inequalities in his favor, and those seem to hold more sway. Now, that's always been true, but this idea that it doesn't have to be that way, well, that's an animating force of modern leftism. And it's an animating idea in Rousseau. Rousseau asks, where did this inequality arise then? And he sees natural man or savage man as being largely equal, with the natural inequalities that he possesses not leading to much difference, since nobody really had anything or even bothered really to compare themselves with others. Not only is inequality something that truly develops in society, but the sense of inequality is something that develops and becomes magnified in society. Because of man's perfectibility, that power of choice, man does not always remain in a savage state. Rather, he gradually improves himself in various ways through the use of fire, the building of shelters, gathering in loose communities, developing language. All of these things develop out of the state of nature, but it doesn't yet develop fully into what Rousseau identifies as society. This is man in a more developed state. It's not a pure state of nature, but it's not society as Rousseau understands it. It's a kind of rustic living which Rousseau calls, quote, precisely the stage reached by the majority of savage peoples known to us. And he characterizes this as being of a middle type between now and the original state of nature. And here's what Rousseau says about this. Thus, although men had become less hardy and natural pity had already suffered some change, because this period in the development of human faculties held a clear middle position between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of our amour-propre, it must have been the happiest and most durable epoch. The more we reflect on this, the more we find that this state was the least subject to revolutions and the best for man, and that he must have emerged from it only through some fatal chance, which for the common utility should never have happened. So man is fallen in Rousseau, fallen through his own fault in a way, and let's look at what that was. What made man fall out of this stable state? Well, it was the development of two technologies. And Rousseau says you need both of them together to ensure this change. You can't just have one. And the technologies are metallurgy and agriculture. It is, as he says, iron and wheat that civilized man. And the reason why this led to a fall, the reason why it became a problem, is that these technologies act as force multipliers on natural differences. Strong men could work harder. Skillful men could turn the work to their advantage more. Ingenious men could find ways to shorten their labor. Further, from the cultivation of land for agriculture necessarily follows a division of land. So this, plus the force multipliers of technology, mean that some few men with greater abilities would become rich, in whatever sense wealth was measured. And the first societies were developed, as Rousseau puts it, to the advantage of these few rich. Rich men in such a state, because of mutual jealousies, unable to join with their equals against an enemy united by a common hope of pillage, and thereupon pressed by necessity, eventually thought of the best conceived project that has ever entered the human mind, to use to his advantage the very forces of those who were attacking him, to turn his adversaries into his defenders, to inspire them with other maxims, and to give them other institutions that were as favorable to him as natural right was against him. So the origin of society and law for Rousseau is, not to put too fine a point on it, essentially a crime. The origin is the rich advantaged themselves under cover of mutual protection. And once one society emerged of this type, it would become indispensable for other men to form societies of a similar type, simply in order to stand up against the united forces of the others. And in other words, as Rousseau puts it, men gave up some of their natural liberty to enjoy the protections of law. But of course, it was the rich who most needed those protections and therefore stood to gain the most from enacting them. So the sacrifice of liberty brought the rich much gain, but to the poor, very little gain at all. If this were the place to go into details, I would easily explain how inequality in credit and authority becomes inevitable among individuals, even without the government getting involved. As soon as they are united in the same society and thus are forced to make comparisons among themselves and to take into account the differences they find and the continual use they must make of one another. These differences are of several kinds, but in general, since riches, nobility or rank, power, and personal merit are the principal distinctions by which people are measured in society, I would prove that the cooperation or the conflict of these various forces is the most certain indication of whether a state is well or badly constituted. Further, if he wanted to go into more detail, he could show how much this universal desire for reputation, honors, and preferment, which devours us all, trains and compares talents and strengths, how much it excites and multiplies the passions, and by turning all men into competitors, rivals, or rather enemies, and making so many contestants run the same course, how much it causes setbacks, successes, and catastrophes of all kinds every day. I would show that it is to this passionate desire to have oneself talked about, to this frantic urge to distinguish ourselves, which keeps us almost always outside ourselves, that we owe what is best and worst among men, our virtues and our vices, our sciences and our mistakes, our conquerors and our philosophers, that is, a multitude of bad things compared to a small number of good ones. Rousseau even goes so far as to suggest that it is by comparing themselves to others that the rich even experience happiness. Finally, I would prove that if one sees a handful of powerful and rich men at the peak of their greatness and fortune, while the crowd grovels in obscurity and misery, it is because the former value the things they enjoy only to the extent that the latter are deprived of them, and because without changing their condition, they would cease to be happy if the people ceased to be wretched. Now, this picture of the wealthy is not even enjoying their wealth so much as seeing others suffer, and that not being happy anymore if the suffering ended. There is a hatred of the aristocrat, the upper class, the wealthy, and the powerful. I mean, a real hatred and resentment of this class of person in Rousseau. It is deep and strong and also absolutely characteristic of modern leftism. Now, in ancient Greece, the democrats hated the oligarchs. And in ancient Rome, the plebs hated the patricians. That rivalry has always been around. But in Rousseau, that old rivalry takes on a different quality, in my view, because Rousseau's view of the matter denies the patrician his claim to justice. Now, Aristotle, as a philosopher, could say, well, they both lay claim to a part of justice. But in Rousseau, that's not possible because the aristocrat's claim is nonsense. It's a lie because it was generated by the aristocrat's desire to keep what he had, and he had more than other men, and unfairly so. Now, I think the modern leftist view, which is intolerant to the point of wanting to exterminate all other regimes, follows in Rousseau's footsteps here. So in conclusion, those are four elements that make Rousseau one of the twin towers of understanding the modern leftist mindset. The other tower, but one I will have to defer to another day, is Hegel.